Welcome to Sonic Legacies, a series of talks on the realm of sound and the cultural, aesthetic, and technological histories linked to it. This series is hosted by the FACE Foundation, and I'm Dr Debashree. As researchers have long argued, the emergence of sound technologies such as telephony, radio broadcasting, and sound recording over the 19th and 20th centuries transformed human life in substantive ways. As the scholar Jonathan Stern points out in his book, The Audible Past, prior to this era where the sound object could be recorded and preserved, quote, very little of the sonic past was physically preserved for historical analysis at a later date, unquote. He interestingly argues that, quote, technologies sometimes enjoy a certain level of deification in social theory and cultural history, where they come to be cast as divine actors, thereby taking on the role of primary agents of historical change. Indeed, the history of sound and its technologies offers us a vantage point into, quote, a field of conjectures among material, economic, technical, ideational, practical, and environmental changes, unquote. It is against this context that the transformation of cinema from the silent era to that of the talkies is a critical shift in the cultural, technological, and aesthetic realms. We have today with us a scholar whose wonderful work examines aspects of these critical linkages and shifts. Her work locates, quote, Indian cinema's transition from the silent era to the talkies within a dense acoustic ecology of already existing oral and technological practices, proposing that the newness of the talkies relied on the ambivalent modernity of the embodied and picturized voice, unquote. I am delighted to introduce Debashree Mukherjee, who is an associate professor of film and media in the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University, New York. Her new book, Bombay Hustle, Making Movies in a Colonial City, approaches cinema as an ecology of material practice and practitioners. Many thanks, Debashree, for taking the time. We're really delighted to have you participate in this. And so without much further ado, I will hand it over to you for your presentation, after which we can get to a few questions. Over to you.
So thank you so much, Gautam. It's really a delight to be invited for this very exciting series that you have curated in a truly inspired way. And I'm looking forward to hearing the other talks. And thank you to DHI Art Space for hosting me. I hope to visit you in person sometime in the near future. So I'll just begin. I'll try and share my screen so you can have some visual accompaniment. Okay, can you see this?
Yes.
Okay, so to begin, so the talk is titled Impassioned Speech, Cinema and Sonic Individuation in Colonial India. In her memoirs, the actress Hansa Watkar recalls working with the German director Franz Osten at Bombay Talkies Studio in the 1930s. Franz Osten didn't speak Hindi or Urdu, and he would always close his eyes during a take, just as the clapboard was being struck. Now, Hansa was very puzzled by a director who wouldn't visually observe his actors' performances, and she finally questioned him about this practice one day. And this is what he said: photography is the cameraman's job. How you act is known to me through your articulation. I've already explained the action to you. The force of your words tells me how you are acting. Now, this is the thing that really intrigued me, right? How do we apprehend the force of words in Indian cinema? Franz Osten's reply to Hansa Watkar points to the embodied nature of voice, the corporeal quality of enunciation. And my presentation today is an attempt to think about the role of speech in early talkie films from India and the implications of the speech for a very hugely popular film form to come. But more than that, also its implications for how to do sonic histories of a critical time in the life of the subcontinent. Now, sound, as Gautam already pointed out, transformed a kind of a social, perceptual experience of modern life across the globe, but also the career of cinema in India. From its novel status as a locally produced entertainment form that was available alongside many other forms, including Hollywood short stunt films, cinema became the reigning cultural imaginary of 20th century India. The success of the talkies is commonly attributed to the South Asian subcontinent's traditional interest in song. And this is a very commonly held view, that into the new medium came a river of music that had flowed through unbroken millennia of dramatic tradition. Now, I've picked up this quote mainly for its overly hyperbolic kind of register, but this is a very commonsensical view, right? That South Asia has had a long tradition of interest in music, and hence the talkies became so popular because of the songs. Now, while I do agree with that, I want to look at a different element of sound, which has been comparatively understudied when we think about cinema, which is speech. And particularly a very emphatically public form of the impassioned speechifying voice. An aesthetics of passionate oration defines the first phase of sound cinema in India, a time when actors' own voices were recorded live on set. So this is a time before playback recording and dubbing, which has become the key characteristic of the song format in Bombay cinema today. What I noticed was a very kind of intriguing declamatory emphasis that emerges in films of this period, the 1930s, which can help us understand why Bollywood films, even today, continue to rely so heavily on dialogue, right? Where dialogue delivery is such a huge part of the attractions of cinema. Now, I'm showing you this image mainly because I love Shah Rukh Khan, but also because it connects with some of the themes of the talk. So this scene from Devdas is just one example of hundreds of scenes of very impassioned dialogue and dialogue delivery, often in fictive or imagined courtrooms. So what's interesting for me here is that Devdas is imagining that he is in a courtroom, and that allows him to make a kind of soliloquy, a very impassioned monologue in a very particular hyperbolic register. And I'm going to look at some courtroom films from the 1930s to connect up with this. So, and additionally, I'm also going to connect a kind of declamatory drive in 1930s talkie films to a thriving public culture of political and pedagogical speech making in colonial India. And my argument methodologically is that the talkie transition must be heard from a transmedial perspective. So within an acoustic ecology that was very defiantly promiscuous in terms of switching platforms. So one can't tell a sonic history of cinema by only looking at film artifacts. One has to be able to think about the other kinds of sonic practices that existed before, during the emergence of cinema and talkie cinema. I will be looking at a survey of surviving as well as lost films of the 1930s, from which I note that early talkie films frequently featured recurring dramatic scenes of energetic oration, often in courts of law. And one of the most interesting things for me here is that these cinematic stagings of what can be called a very affective vocality regularly mobilized women's sounding bodies to highlight the performative logics of argumentation. So also an interesting contrast to thinking about Devdas, right? One of the most iconic male protagonists and iconic hero figures in Bombay cinema, to a very different kind of imagination of the voicing body in the 1930s that is most definitively female. So now we move to the next section where I'll discuss this concept of acousmatic attunement. Sonic imaginations are fundamentally relational. Sound in cinema is a sonic phenomenon that draws on conjunctural acoustic practices and is thus not a discrete thing in itself. It's a relational thing. Diverse acoustic ecologies proliferated in late 1920s and early 1930s South Asia, which were inhabited by multiple communities of listeners and many heterogeneous practices of listening. These included dramatic soliloquies in the urban form known as Parsi theatre, gramophone records, live salon performances, folk entertainments, spiritual and religious music traditions, as well as revolutionary songs and speeches that were being mobilized in the anti-colonial movement. And you can think about the Prabhat Feri processions that were moving through Bombay at this time. Technological mediations of the human voice also started to multiply during this time. In 1924, more than a decade before the All India Radio Bombay station was set up, which was in 1936, an intrepid group of radio, telegraphy, and telephony enthusiasts started the Bombay Radio Club. Still, the idea of a sound source that was completely disconnected from the original scene of production of live sound took a lot of getting used to. For example, when a radio dance program was proposed as the main entertainment at the Grand Hotel in Bombay in 1924, it created quite a stir because patrons and dancers, and I'm quoting, were somewhat shy of the idea of a hidden band. So the dancers were unable to dance to a band that they could not see. Right? Now, this shyness towards disembodied sound emanating from a metal contraption is a repeat phenomenon that is noticed across the subcontinent. And gradually it starts to shift because as more and more access to gramophones and radio starts to grow. So listeners slowly start to learn new cultural techniques and they start to attune themselves to imagine the voicing body beyond the machine. And that voicing body could be the brass band, it could be a singer that they cannot see. Now, this gradual kind of history is what I call acousmatic attunement. And it allows us to revisit the cultural significance and the affective pleasures of the talkie film in India. Now, acousmatic is a concept that has been theorized in great depth by Pierre Schaeffer and Michel Chion. And it refers to a sound whose source remains unseen. And so acousmatic sound would include offstage voices in theater or off-screen sound in film. Now, the radio, telephone, and gramophone can be considered acousmatic technologies because they transmit voices that are separated from images of bodies. Now, in the 20th century, if you called up your friend on the phone, you could not see her face, as you can see today, right? You would have to imagine your friend's face while you were hearing her voice. Now, regular use and enjoyment of these acousmatic media started to normalize the separation of sound from image as listeners no longer needed or required some kind of unified sounding object, be it a human or a musical instrument, right in front of them. Acousmatic attunement thus emerges as a cultural technique, which is a very learned ability to be alive to the hidden source of sound while simultaneously discounting visual absence or ocular absence. Now, distant listening and speaking from afar became a very defining experience of life in the city at this time. And it marked a very powerful social and perceptual shift in attitudes towards liveness and immediacy. Now, talkie cinema picks up on the many possibilities of these acousmatic mediations, including the romantic possibilities of the telephone, framing the telephone as a modern device that can help lovers transcend social codes of modesty. Now, a song from industrial India, 1938, explains this. And I'm translating the lyrics. It says, "Come, my love, come. Let us say something into the phone. Why do you shy from saying what is in your heart? I am not by your side, and so there's no reason to blush. Let us speak from afar." Right? So the lover is trying to persuade his beloved that the voice on the telephone is disembodied, dislocated from his body, and therefore beyond the jurisdiction of social and moral propriety. So very clever kind of a ploy by the lover on the telephone. But nevertheless, his shy beloved intuits that the mediated voice also carries something corporeal with it wherever it goes. And this is something that Roland Barthes has called the grain of the voice. That is the body in the voice. So the corporeality of the voice cannot be disavowed. It sticks to the mediated voice. You listen not only with your ears, but with your whole body. To hear, therefore, is to feel. This persistent corporeality complicates the idea of acousmatic attunement and reminds us that simply by separating an image from the voice doesn't erase the body, which is why telephonic exchange can indeed become the site of erotic drama. It is important to note that in India, technologies of sound transmission and reproduction were not initially or primarily private forms of consumption, but had a collective address and reception. And this was largely because of the high costs of individual radio sets and gramophones. And so these devices were used at public venues and were often understood as community listening technologies. So to think these technologies as public media rather than as private media compels us to think of radio, gramophone, loudspeaker, cinema as technologies that also produced collectivities of listening publics. And soon in the eyes of the British colonial administration, these collective listening publics got transformed into agitated listening crowds. And here is where I'll make a different shift now to think about political speech making. Now, on March 14th, 1931, Abhishe Mukherjee released, most famously, South Asia's first talkie feature film, Alam Ara, or The Light of the World. The very next week, on March 23rd, 1931, a young anti-imperialist revolutionary, Bhagat Singh, was secretly hanged along with his comrades Sukhdev and Rajguru. Now, apart from the coincidence that this was taking place, both these events took place in March 1931, is there any other connection that we can make between these two events? Now, Bhagat Singh was himself a cinephile, and the scholar Daniel Ilam has recently suggested that he might have modeled his revolutionary avatar after the screen icon Sulochana. And this is famously a film that he'd enjoyed, in which he takes on multiple disguises. Now, this is a very tantalizing suggestion. And for me, what's interesting here is that it points to the idea that cinema and revolutionary politics might have had a very direct connection in this period. And so let's think about this a little bit more through acousmatic sound and impassioned speech. By the end of March 1931, after the hanging of Bhagat Singh, many so-called seditious speeches were being delivered across the country, urging the youth of India to avenge the execution of Bhagat Singh. And the historian Sumit Sarkar has argued that political oratory in the early 20th century must be seen as a major communications revolution, which helps constitute the entity known as the people, which is a very key feature of political modernity. And an increasingly nervous British government responded to this proliferation of nationalist, communist, and anarchist revolutionary speech by intensifying censorship and bringing in charges of seditious speech against public leaders. But the British were focused always in their censorship attempts on exact words that were spoken at live events. And this led to the use of shorthand as a mode of recording so-called incendiary speech and surveilling that speech. But what has to be noted here is that in this transcription of speech into shorthand or text, something elusive is always missing, right? The performativity of the voice, for example, affective registers of tone, timbre, volume, speed, the clearing of throats, the raising of the voice, pauses, emphatic exclamations, which are all very, very crucial to the rousing power of a public speech. All of that would be missing in a shorthand transcription. And this makes the emotional impact of political oratory unavailable almost for colonial surveillance, inaudible for the disciplinary apparatus. On the other hand, newspaper reports about sedition trials in courtrooms created a very interested reading public that started to consume political speeches in print form. So even defense statements, such as Bhagat Singh's own defense that he made during his assembly case trials, were published for sale and circulation for reading publics. So was there something that these consumers of Bhagat Singh's speeches who were reading them, was there something that they could hear that was not available to the colonial disciplinary ear? So here again, I think acousmatic attunement becomes a useful way to think about how certain very motivated readers were able to imagine the body behind the printed words, the speaker behind the screen, so to speak. The body always hovers over the page and can inflame the imagination. And here is where I want to turn now to the courtroom film. One of the fundamental paradoxes of the popularity of sound cinema in India had to do with the body of the singing and speaking film actress. In the years of silent cinema, Bombay's emerging film industry tried very hard to distance itself from the supposedly tainted female dancers and singers who had helped build Indian cinema. There was a lot of discussion and controversy about actresses, their morality, should respectable women join films, and so on. Now, during the talkie transition, the same tainted but trained voices became completely necessary. They provided a ready-made workforce and once again threatened the public space of cinema with a different kind of acoustic charge. And cinema directly confronted this threat. Film after film in the 1930s features women vocally defending themselves or their loved ones through impassioned speech. From Shanta Apte's fiery discourses in a film like Duniya Na Mane to fearless Nadia, who preaches in her films, preaches to lovers, to villains, to fathers, all alike. The consolidation of female talkie stardom was largely premised on speech. Now, so of particular interest to me is the recurrence of the courtroom as a space for agonistic dialogue and excited speech in the 1930s. In Miss 1933, Gohar pleads her own case in court in a case of murder in self-defense. In Bharat Ki Beti, Ratanbai masquerades as a man to depose in the courtroom. In Mother, Manika defends Devika Rani in a courtroom trial. And in Jeevan Lata, Sabita Devi argues the case for her lover in court. Actresses in these films often play the character of lady barristers. And very frequently, the narrative role of these characters is to contest social and colonial legal ideas of morality and justice. So producing a different kind of episteme, of a different idea of ethics and morality that goes contrary to colonial and legal ideas of morality. Now, in the world outside of cinema and filmic representation, the presence of women in Indian courtrooms looked quite different. During the trials of Bhagat Singh, much ado was made of the hysterical behavior of Batukeshwar Dutt's sister, who apparently screamed and shouted in the courtroom, pouring abuse upon magistrate, police, government, and all their generation. Now, she remains unnamed across newspapers, but this is the way in which the event was described, right, as hysterical. Her cries continued for a fairly long time. She was eventually forcibly removed from the courtroom, and all women were barred from the courtroom for the rest of the trial proceedings. Now, this very gender treatment of politically active young women, whether in the actually existing courtroom or in newspaper reportage of them, can be read as a very strategic response by the government and by mainstream newspapers, a response to the emergence of the educated middle-class woman as a very visible and dangerous actor in the independence movement. So this is a particular kind of gendered response to contain this transgressive force of the anti-colonial young woman. The gendered history of the voice in society and culture assumes that voice is a conduit to self-truth, right? A direct channel to the self, an emblem of the rational, democratic, and male agent. On the other hand, the grainy, corporeal voice, right, has been historically rendered feminine, at least in the Western imagination. In this context, courtroom films of the 1930s deliberately confuse entrenched binaries between male and female, rational and emotional. Female speaking subjects, as the ones you're seeing on screen right now, present impassioned, highly emotional arguments, but in the language of the law, right? So confusing that distinction between rationality and emotionalism, between the legal and the intimate. So how do we think about this huge contrast between the actual presence or absence of women in India's courtrooms and the proliferation of women's bodies in cinema's courtrooms at this time? And I would suggest that there are many ways to make sense of this if we look at different registers: the aesthetic history of cinema, the industrial history of cinema, and the technological history of cinema. Cinema often provides a space for that which is contemporaneously considered socially impossible. And that is true of cinema today as well. Practices that seem impossible today, but there are intimations that there could be a future in which they would be possible. Now, played out on the speaking body of the actress, courtroom scenes brought together the rational and the irrational, the corporeal with the intellectual, the masculine with the feminine, in very conspicuous and very thrilling ways. And the thrill is important because that was clearly part of the attraction of these films that brought thousands of people thronging to the cinema halls, most of them being men in terms of viewership. Now, frequently in these films, we see a younger generation of educated barrister ladies defending an older generation of courtesans and performers. And that's the case in this film, Mother Mamta, where this is a young barrister, Manika, who is defending a courtesan who has been accused of murder. So two models of femininity are being presented within such a courtroom arena. And that corresponds to the coexistence of two actress demographics in the 1930s, which was creating a lot of tension. So the 1930s saw a huge move to industrially kind of make cinema more respectable by hiring educated, college-educated, even married Hindu women. But at the same time, there also existed many other kinds of actress demographics from courtesan backgrounds, non-Hindu backgrounds, unmarried, Jewish, Eastern European, and a huge diversity. Now, this coexistence of these two kinds of actress demographics, I'm arguing that created this tension, which is directly confronted in these kinds of courtroom scenes, where one model of ideal Indian woman is defending another kind of woman who also claims status of ideal Indianness. And this is most pointedly exemplified in the film Jeevan Lata, where a barrister hero is disgusted when he sees his beloved dancing in a public performance. But when he is wrongly accused of murder, it is the same dancing girl who comes to his defense. And this becomes very literal because it turns out that the infamous dancing girl, unknown to the hero, also has a law degree from Oxford. So here we see in the same body, in the same woman, she's inhabiting both dancing girl, but she's also actually a trained lady barrister. So to conclude, the courtroom film in pre-independence India locates the so-called problem of a very vocal female talent pool, locates this in the actress's singing voice, right? So are you a professional singer? Then you're tainted. But what I'm arguing is that this early talkie film uses speech as a means to address that problem of the singing woman, right? The Gaane Wali. It highlights the complex claims made on talkie actresses who were at once real women playing fictional characters, Indian women performing tropes of Indian femininity, and modern women who were embodying the technological and social promises of the cinematic age. In the thick of these paradoxical pressures, the 1930s actress, as a film worker, is enjoined to present her own case in public through these courtroom scenes of argumentation. What is worth remembering here is that the new on-screen human voice is not just directly available to the viewer, listener, but is mediated. It is just as ephemeral and mass reproduced as the voice on the radio. So in highlighting this in-between status of the human voice and the in-between status of the acousmatic voice in cinema, what I want to stress is that the voice in this early moment of talkie film in India becomes a site of a speculative modernity, which enables new imaginations of the self and one's relation to the world. So this, an attunement to the gap between the real identity of the body that is producing the sound and the mediated sound that one is hearing, enables a huge amount of play and speculation that also for me allows a lot of these real women to be able to navigate the very tense movements between the clamor for moral respectability and the heady kind of excitement that audiences feel when they see the modern woman on screen. Acousmatic listening presumes that meaning is unstable and that identities are performative. The film actress in all her glorious, polyphonous social presence was central to the consolidation of Bombay's talkie industry. And she was met halfway, I would suggest, by India's very canny listening audiences who intuited the altered possibilities for the self in a mediated and technologized modernity. A culture of acousmatic attunement accounts for the excitement of seeing the synchronized voicing body on screen, and at the same time creates a fantasy space where mediated female bodies could offer multiple visions of performative becoming. And with that, I will end my talk. Thank you.
Okay, so that was a really wonderful, really illuminating presentation, Debashree. Many, many thanks for taking the time to put that together for us. And there are a lot of great, fascinating ideas there that you sort of evoked, particularly, in sort of looking back at these ideas, in some sense, you seem to have brought not just the material of sound to center stage, but also the conceptual notion of sound itself as a legitimate means of historical ideas. Mm-hmm. In examining these, several of these different aspects of your presentation, how do you do you see that as a as a description of what you've presented?
I know that part of the kind of core interest of the series that you've planned is how I think sound can be a means of approaching the past. For me, when I started the project, sound wasn't really a central concern. But soon it became evident to me that it would be ridiculous to be thinking about the talkie period without engaging with sound materially, right? Not just as something that's an excuse for the consolidation of a film industry, but what does the sound mean? Can you feel it, right? What is the texture of this thing? And how does it impact the bodies of the cine workers that I'm primarily interested in? And as I got more and more into the research, I felt like I should have written a whole book on sound in this time period. Yeah. And there's two parts to this statement. One is that one would assume that it's impossible to write about a sonic history of the 1930s, right? When even the films that were made at that time are primarily lost. So by a conservative estimate, 95% of talkie films made in the 30s are considered lost. So no one might ever be able to watch them. So what kind of a history can one write then of sound, which is already so ephemeral, right? Nobody can ever claim authoritatively to say, this is what a film sounded like in March 1931 in Palace Talkies, because that experience can never be recreated. So it's both impossible in many senses, but if one looks at certain alternative ways for tracking history of sound, then there might be a proliferation of traces.
Right. You particularly mention practices and practitioners as part of this ecology of understanding these concerns. So perhaps the ideas generated by practices and practitioners, and even material culture for that matter, these could perhaps provide other cues, right?
Yeah, most definitely. I think your entire kind of assumption about a particular time period changes when we start looking at different kinds of objects and sites. So, for example, if someone said, "Okay, I'm writing a history about talkie cinema," the first obvious thing to do would be to look at the surviving talkie films, and just based on that, one would write a whole history, right? Of what were these early films like? What topics did they pursue? What was the kind of instrumentation, musical composition, song choreography? But what if one started to think that, okay, maybe we can think about how we get to the conditions through which that image is produced? So, what were the practices of the production and recording of sound? And then a whole other history comes into view, right? So, if I'm not interested only in Sulochana's singing performance in a film, but I start thinking about what did it feel like for Sulochana to be even able to reimagine herself from a silent actress to a talkie actress. And then you find these fascinating anecdotes of, say, what they're calling the vocal shot. So actresses having nervous breakdowns, being confronted with a microphone, right, which seems really hilarious to us today. But it's a huge kind of shift when your performance is not just dependent on another actor in front of you or the camera, but there's this other object, the microphone, that now also is part of what you're acting with or against. And then the requirements that you're not just a pretty face or an emoting face, but you have to have what is called a mic suiting voice. That creates a lot of tension. It eliminates a lot of actors and actresses from the possibility of a career. And that tells you a different kind of story of what talkie cinema meant at this time.
There are many, many debates about the privileging of vision as a primary sense and the predominance of visual culture, as an area of study. What do you think about that?
So that's actually a very interesting question. I don't work on contemporary, not in this book, I didn't work on contemporary film. But if one thinks about it, actually, I think the history of popular mainstream cinema from India has always gone against the grain of this idea of the predominance of the optic, because song has been such a huge part of popular Indian cinemas across many regions, that cinema for, I think, most film lovers, the ordinary, everyday ticket buying film viewers, has been as much about the music as about the visual. So I think if one thinks about popular film form from certain contexts like India, in the 20th century, I don't think that we can say that cinema is only about the dominance of vision. So I think where you're thinking from kind of complicates that narrative a bit. That kind of argument has been made from the West, thinking mostly about very classical art forms like painting, for example. And of course, cinema has been studied, and that is a fault of the academy, from a kind of a visual centric perspective. But if one is alive to the actual experience and the pleasures that, and what has cinema meant in society in India, then one will know automatically that there are many other things going on here than the image on the screen. So think, for example, back when the interval used to be a very big deal. People step out for a smoke or to get a gold spot or whatever it is. And you know what's happening in the theater because you can hear it. And you're like, okay, I'm not interested. There's another song coming up, or the song has come up. Now I must go back inside. Or you get a sense of the ambience or the particular mood on screen because you know the sonic cues. Okay, the hero is giving some big dialogue. Oh, actually, the heroine is crying right now. Oh, this is happening. And then you decide whether you want to go back into the theater or not. So people are very trained in India for sonic cues that give you a huge guide to the emotion and the meaning of the film. So, but I think there's a lot of work that we all have to do that is more attuned to sonic histories. And that is, we're all guilty of ignoring sound. And even in the way people, I think, cover popular film in terms of criticism, like film critics, film reviews, you'll talk about song, but very rarely do people write about sound design or sound editing or sound transitions, right?
Exactly. Okay, so, there's also the aspect of material cultures and the role of material cultures in shaping these trajectories. For instance, arguably, you point to the microphone as being a disruptive kind of presence initially. How do you see aesthetic outcomes linked to, particularly in the work that you've done? Have you come across ideas or thoughts or anecdotes related to aesthetic outcomes because of a certain kind of technology or material?
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. That how does the coming of a particular technology, a sound technology, change the aesthetic form, right, of the image? And many decisions had to be made, and often they were just purely to kind of manage contingency, right? Just very pragmatic things. So, for example, in the early days of the talkies, there was a lot of care that was taken to make sure that any musical score would be seen to have a very direct narrative justification, right? So you can't have a background score out of nowhere without explaining it to the viewers, because we are still figuring out, how to make sense of these things. So a lot of films in the mid 1930s would feature very kind of contrived setups so that you could actually show a band of musicians playing on screen. So these are very direct kind of techniques that were devised to visualize where is musical accompaniment coming from. That stops becoming a problem very soon. People again let you be acousmatically attuned. You imagine this is coming from somewhere. It's part of the pleasure and the unexplainability of many things that are cinema.
To wrap things up, sound being a source of knowledge itself. I mean, that in the academy too, there's been quite a bit of mobility and sound studies, and these kinds of areas of research and exploration are becoming more and more activated. How do you broadly see these changes around you?
I think it's actually a very productive and generative shift, this so-called, turn to sound. There are many things in it that are exciting for me. One is, I think it has a very, thinking with sound immediately gives you a particular kind of philosophical understanding or approach to ideas of reality and truth, right? Which is part of what I was trying to discuss in terms of the speculative gap, right? Which allows actresses to perform two things at once. So I think if you think seriously with what is sound, how is it produced, right? For example, the human voice. Does this voice belong to me? Does it only come from me? It's obviously something that comes from my body, right? From my throat. but it has to interact with these sonic vibrations through the air. Then it's going through my computer right now and reaching you through your speakers on the other side. So which part of the sound you're hearing is me? So for some, it might seem like a frivolous question, but for me, and I think for many sound scholars, these are very profound questions, because I think especially in an age where we are surrounded by disinformation, fake news, propaganda, it becomes very important for us to constantly be alert to questions of who is speaking, how do you kind of adjudicate authenticity, and what can you gain from being alert to ideas of, these questions of representation, authentic location, truth, and the possibility for doctoring things. So I think sound has a lot to offer us also in this age of fake news and social media propaganda, to be attuned to this, that realities are multiple and the onus is on us, right, to try and figure out where the truth seems to lie. So I'm very excited about those philosophical implications, I think, which have also social and political implications. And I think also it's high time that for scholars of Indian cinema, we really started to think about the materiality of sound, and sound beyond just the most famous singers, but also think about the techniques, practices, the relation between sound and image, and give a lot of our sound designers, sound editors, their due in helping us think about the power of Bombay, of Indian cinema.
On that very solemn and provocative finish to the presentation, I'd like to thank you again, Debashree. It's been wonderful chatting with you, and really very grateful for you taking the time to chat with us.
Thank you so much, Gautam. We need more people like you who are able to fluidly do that, straddle the worlds of practice and theory, and you can curate these exciting events. So thanks to you.